delegation that... Oh, just got the recording in progress message, sorry. Today we're going to be hearing back from a trade union delegation that went to Ukraine last week, which was organised with PCS Union. PCS National Conference passed a policy back in the spring to continue supporting the Ukrainian resistance, to offer practical support to Ukrainian trade unions, and also to organise a solidarity delegation, which I'm really looking forward to hearing more about. But before we start, I've just got one announcement to make. When the delegation was in Ukraine, it met with health workers who are members of the Free Trade Union of Medical Workers. They also delivered medical aid to the union to support its members' work. And since the summer, the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign has been raising money for an appeal from a branch of the union in a mining area of Ukraine to support a hospital that's getting a large number of people coming through the doors who've been wounded in the war. So far, I'm really pleased to say that it's raised over £5,300, and we've just launched a new stage of the crowdfunder, which is running till January. So I'll put the link in the chat shortly. Please do donate if you can, share it widely, put it out to your trade union branch or to other organisations that you're part of. But now, without further ado, let me introduce the three members of the delegation. So firstly, we're going to hear from Chris Ford, the Secretary of the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. Then we'll hear from Beverly Laidlaw, who's a member of the NEC, the National Executive Committee of PCS, and then John Maloney, the union's Assistant General Secretary. So every speaker will speak for up to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. As I mentioned before, I'll need to leave at 9, and then I'll pass the chairing on to Chris. But over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Nadia. And sorry, one moment. Sorry, can you hear me? Oh, beg your pardon. Thank you, Nadia. And obviously, I want to begin also with a thank you to PCS for the opportunity to join them in this delegation to Ukraine. I think if I was to sum up the words which could best describe what I would take from the situation there, it would be resilience, resistance, continued resistance. There is anxiety, and then certainly there are concerns. So and one point that really came home to me is that here we are a decade since the Maidan, since the popular rebellion in 2014, and then assembly proposals, war. And in that time, it's very much the case that civil society is hugely intact, is very active, and this was very evident from the meetings we were having. So far from Putin having successfully deterred or crushed civil society in Ukraine, it's absolutely vibrant. And if we could take, there was numerous examples, but one of the main I would say was that we saw was the trade unions, the youth networks that we see. I saw, and there's a widespread networks of volunteers all across Ukraine, engaged in an array of activities around the war, around reconstruction, around the provision of aid. With the trade unions, we took with us part of what is a £10,000 of aid for the Medical Workers Union, which is principally going to assist people in the front line. And also alongside this sort of work, there was, you can see there was a trade union lifeline of the Federation of Trade Unions and the youth network, led by the chair of the youth section, Ivana Krapko. which is engaged in a constant aid delivery. And the Confederation of Free Trade Unions seemed very much to be a hub and a conduit of aid that is being processed through the various affiliates and branches of the union. And so the union seemed absolutely central to the war effort and to sustaining local communities, local members of the union who are either in communities that are on the frontline areas or being impacted by the war, or members that are serving in the armed forces at the front. The KVPU Congress took place on one day we were there. That is the Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and it was to elect their leadership. And there was representatives from all across Ukraine, including the Donbass, the Zaporizhia, Kherson, areas which are all directly impacted on the front lines of the invasion. And alongside meeting with the members who attended that Congress, we were also able to go firsthand and meet with trade union members and with the leadership of the union at one of the children's hospitals in Kyiv, which alongside having to deal with the impact of the war, of large numbers of internally displaced people who are now in Kyiv from the war-torn areas, they're having to deal with the attacks through very dogmatic neoliberal reforms being imposed by the Ukrainian government in a time of war. And this is far-reaching imposition of neoliberal reforms on the health service, with a clear agenda to create the conditions for privatization and to replace the National Health Service in Ukraine. And the workers were making difficult choices between wages and job cuts and sustaining the health service in the face of this war. And it was particularly heartbreaking to be informed that in a children's hospital, it is a significant problem that parents will not leave their children in the hospital regularly because of fear of Russian bombing. And this is symptomatic of the nature of the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine, but a large number of medical facilities have been bombed alongside schools and education facilities. So it tells us something about how people are feeling, the anxieties that they're having. And also at the conference we were at, the medical workers had also were there from a hospital we visited in July, Novovolinsk, which was actually due for closure, a hospital which has 800 beds, 40% are wounded soldiers and soldiers in rehabilitation, and nevertheless they were planning to close it entirely. And it's absolutely shocking the reform that's been introduced. So the activism of the unions is inspiring, it's ongoing, and far from the labour laws that were introduced having in any way impeded the activities. There's certainly widespread activism, particularly in the context of the war. Trade unions are not without the problems, they're not without bureaucracy, but there's certainly a resilience in their activity. Alongside this, I would say that I spoke at a conference of youth of the education trade union affiliated to the Federation of Trade Unions. Doesn't just include university workers, schools and colleges, it also includes the students themselves. And this was well attended again from all over Ukraine, with many young people who were active in volunteer work alongside activism in the universities. Dormitories were also shared with refugees in universities, and many young people were engaged in voluntary work of aid to areas undergoing reconstruction that had been formerly occupied, and to victims of the war, and also to the front on it. And also we were able to meet with the independent trade union Priyama Dia, and this union is an independent student union which has been through many phases and has revived significantly in the new forms. And they had a demonstration at the time we were in Ukraine on the 14th of November at the Lviv National Polytechnic University against a particularly xenophobic professor, and Irina Farian, who is was even condemning any Russian-speaking servicemen in the Ukrainian armed forces, and a young person from Crimea had written to her. She then published their details, and was then that poor individual was then picked up by the Russian secret police, the FSB. They had a large protest at the university, and it was quite good to see, you know, that they were victorious and Farian was removed. There was two areas there, but there's other areas that I'd like to cite where young people were engaged in really quite inspiring activity, and we visited the towns of Moshun, Horenka, and Bucha, which were formerly occupied by the Russians in the Kiev Oblast, the Kiev region, and they were liberated last April. April in the first year of the war, sorry, and these young people involved in this network helped Bucha and other areas around there had been involved in support for those areas since the liberation. In Horenka, temporary accommodation is still there in good quality compared to others, but nevertheless, it is just porta cabins that were designed for soldiers that are ravaged with condensation in the winter and overheat in the summer. And for 2 years, people have been living like this there. Motion, similarly, where young people have been involved in assisting there through this NGO that local people were self-organized and are still living in what were building sheds that they're also sharing with other liberated areas. So, and they are wooden sheds, which, you know, are good quality, but the temporary accommodation, and also some people rebuilding their own houses. And this had been a scene of quite fierce fighting and destruction when the Russians had invaded, and significant deaths. And it does contrast the Bucha, which is very well known for its war crimes, where there's clearly been a lot of investment. So it's inspiring the work that young people are doing, the youth there are doing, but it also highlights the real deficiency in the state and the local authorities, the various involvement in local authorities. And it's so much of the war effort has been carried out by people themselves. And there is not a war economy. This is something particularly highlighted by the left. Contrary to myths, there is a left in Ukraine, which is also very active. And we met with Socialny Ruch, with SD Platform, and Socialny Ruch are emphasizing quite strongly the need for a social economy, a state-led war economy. And instead, we have a neoliberal model, which is fragmenting and completely unsuitable in conditions of resisting an invasion. And this is certainly very notable in the provisions of reconstruction already that are taking place. In terms of when I began, I spoke about the anxieties that I think continue to exist in Ukrainian society. There are certainly in Kiev, it was described as a cocoon, and people are living, you know, in ways perhaps differently from others outside of that of it. But and that itself is a way, I suppose, a symbol of resistance that people are trying to lead a normal life. But there is anxieties that the Ukraine is a small country compared to Russia. It doesn't have those resources. The winter is coming. Russia's stockpiling its weapons. It's launched one offensive in Avdiivka, which Ukrainians have beat back. The bombing is increasing, and we can expect a sustained assault in the winter, which people are anxious is coming. But then there's other anxieties that we can see that are looming, and that is anxieties of the year ahead. It's quite understandable, and this was expressed by the Journal Kritika that we met, that Ukraine wasn't given the weapons to enable it to conduct a fully successful counteroffensive. Indeed, many of the long-range missiles were given after the offensive had begun, and only then could they begin to destroy Russian air power. And this is an anxiety as the year ahead comes. Will Ukraine have the support it needs and the weapons it needs in a situation where there's political turmoil in the world, focus elsewhere? We have the elections in the USA, and not everyone has an answer to that, or maybe indeed want to focus on it at this time, but it is a concern, and it's certainly a big concern for us. But despite this, there is still this overwhelming situation that even if there may be sections of society not speaking loudly that may be prepared to be considering a peace, there is certainly no overwhelming desire to allow the country to be partitioned or handed over to the Russians, and Ukrainians have no choice but to fight. And I certainly didn't hear anyone argue that there should be a peace deal with Putin, the continued occupation. And I think that's where the resilience is certainly evidently continuing and will continue.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for speaking particularly about the youth section of I think it was the Confederation of Free Trade Unions that has organised a youth network, and for situating this within the context that the left in Ukraine is facing, which is both Russia's illegal invasion, but also neoliberal reforms and anti-union laws from the Ukrainian government. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from the next speakers. Next, I'm going to pass on to Beverly Laidlaw from PCS. Thanks, Beverly.
Thanks, Nadia, and thanks for everyone attending. So for people who don't know me, I'm Bev Laidlaw. I'm on the NEC, and part of my roles within the NEC, two of the committees I belong to are the Women's Committee and the Disabled Workers and Members Committee. But I'm also on Department for Work and Pensions Group Executive Committee. So I first of all want to say, I mean, it was such a privilege to attend and to go on this delegation. I met some, completely agree with Chris, some absolutely inspiring people all the way along, even on my start of my journey, where I met a woman, Natalie, who was coming back to Kyiv to take some exams, but without her I wouldn't have been able to have a good night's sleep on that sleeper train. It is a really long and hard journey, but I would really encourage anybody to go and be part of any delegation that is going in the future. I've never been to Ukraine before, so it was a massive eye-opener for myself to actually see everything in real life, and to be able to talk about the conditions in Ukraine, but also what Ukrainians wanted their future to look like. And I think that was really important. So from a woman's perspective, and some of the questions I asked some of the people we met in the trade unions, including the FBU president, was around many of the women that have fled Ukraine and have sought refuge in other countries and have got jobs. And I know in the department I work in, supported Ukrainian people find work that they required and wanted, about how they were able to come back to Ukraine once the war is over, and about rebuilding Ukraine, and about having really decent jobs for them when they did return, because many women I've spoken to from Ukraine that did flee have left jobs within Ukraine, and when they want to go back, and they do want to go back, they want to be able to have those jobs and have employment rights as well. We didn't get all the answers we wanted. They do want their women back, but I think there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of ensuring that women's rights and equal pay and all those types of things are looked at moving forward. Because for me, looking at the job market within Ukraine at the moment, yes, we want to rebuild, but we met with the health workers union, not the free independent medical workers, but the health workers unions, where they did talk about the majority of their workers were women workers, and they had managed to secure some pay rises, but they were very open around the privatisation that was going to be coming forward out of the reforms that the government were going to be making. And for me, that was a warning signal, really, around the jobs for those women to come back to, but also the security of rebuilding their lives in Ukraine when they do return. And it was also quite interesting, and I think what Chris said earlier about the anxiety of people is doubly founded when we talk to one of the unions, which was around the energy and electrical workers unions, and around the fact that many people in the power stations weren't able to leave their jobs in areas that are under massive risk from being bombed, and at risk at the moment, and coming through the winter. And it was very much a case of those families not being able to stay together in a family unit because they were separated, because obviously the children and the mothers were having to flee because their fathers couldn't to any safe areas of Ukraine, or safer areas of Ukraine as well. But then moving on, really, so sorry, my daughter's just decided to come in the room. But one of the things that really touched and concerned me was the visits we made on the Thursday and Friday. So the visits that we made to, I think I'm pronouncing this right, please forgive me if I've got, to Moshin, around the fact that this is a village that they're having to rebuild their houses on their own. There isn't any government support. There isn't any, they're getting support from volunteers and from NGOs, but they're building it brick by brick. And as Chris said, also volunteering for them to make these wooden huts to give out to their neighbours, but in other parts of Ukraine as well, so that people would have somewhere to live while they themselves rebuilt their houses. As a mother, I found it quite difficult, especially around the fact that there was many children in that village that were not having anything and to be joyful about, around even colouring pens and paper and colouring books and things like that, to make sure that actually the trauma they're going through the war, they get a little bit of release from that. And that was the same in the hospital we visited. My children have been in out of hospital over the years. I think I'm very lucky where I live in Sheffield. I take them to a children's A&E. There's toys, there's books, there's everything else for them, isn't there, to make that stay in hospital as comfortable as possible. In one of the wards we went to, and I think there was over 40 children in around those wards, there was an old portable TV and a couple of jigsaws. And I found that quite heartbreaking, that through the trauma all of those children had faced throughout this war, that they were now in hospital, separated from their parents, being able to live in that accommodation and getting the treatment. But actually part of their treatment needs to be a psychological recovery. And so I know that within the network I work in Department for Work and Pensions, Chris is going to give me some details, and we're going to link up with the NGOs and try and do some Christmas boxes for the children, just so that there is a little bit of joy for them, so that they don't see that everything is just bombs and just alarms and living in the cold, because there is no heating, or there's very little heating where they're living in the temporary housing. So whatever anybody else can do and help with that, if you're PCS on here, please get in touch with me or John. We can make sure that we can get quite a lot of this. But what did resonate with me was the amount of thank yous we received just for going and taking the medical aid over to them. Many people reduced to tears, thanking us just for going over and being prepared to witness what they live like and what they're going through during this war, but also what they want their country to look like at the end of the war. And also, probably most importantly, their willingness to keep fighting, their willingness for them to be the people that make the decision about what happens in this war, and how their independence and how Ukraine is theirs, and they make the decisions on it all. And I'll leave it at there, because I know John's got quite a lot to say as well, hopefully. Excuse me. But any questions, please let me know. I will leave it as, if you get the chance to go, please go and visit and show your solidarity. It's the most important thing to those people at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly, and thank you particularly for speaking about the impact that the war is having on women workers who are before the war were in often like feminized workplaces in quite exploitative conditions. And it reminds us that after the war, we need a just reconstruction, which includes, as you say, decent jobs for people to return to, also for people to have agency and a democratic say in what the reconstruction looks like. And it obviously has to include debt cancellation from our government as well. I'm going to pass on now to John Maloney, the Assistant Gensec of PCS.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you to Ukraine Solidarity Campaign for organising this meeting. Inevitably, I'm going to cover some of the areas that Chris and Bev have discussed. I just want to re-emphasise, though, the point that Bev made at the end, that it is important to go to Ukraine. Now, it is arduous in the sense of you are subjected to long train journeys, but it's not arduous in the sense of it's dangerous or it's particularly difficult. It's just that it requires a bit of organisation, but the reward, as Bev and Chris have said, it is immense. And it is slightly bizarre, people who are living constantly under war conditions who actually say to you how brave you are to actually go to Ukraine. And obviously we're not, because we spent a few days there, yes, and then we left. The brave people are the people who stay behind, particularly as we face the winter. And just to reinforce what Chris says, there is a widespread belief that Russia will attempt the tactic it did last year, which is to attack the heating and electricity infrastructure of the country, to literally freeze the country into submission or into death. And quite rightly, we condemn collective punishment of the Israeli army against Gazans. This is equivalent. There are cold-blooded generals in Moscow now working about how, when it gets very cold, and in Ukraine, we're talking of temperatures -15, -20 are typical in a Ukrainian winter. They're thinking, when it really drops the temperature, how can we literally freeze people? How can we cut power off, which obviously will be power off to hospitals as well? And in one sense, I do see a lot of parallels between the Israeli attack on Gaza and obviously the Russian attack on Ukraine. Both people want self-determination, and I think that has to be a consistent principle. And certainly PCS in the conference motion passed was very clear about that principle of self-determination. And an allied point to what Bev said is that only the Ukrainian people can decide about peace. Whilst I do accept that there are many well-wishers who genuinely, for various reasons, want there to be peace, what they're really saying to the Ukrainians is you have to have peace on Russia's terms, because peace in itself is much more important than your land, your sovereignty, etc. I don't accept that any more than I would accept a Gazan saying, because I'm under constant attack by the Israeli state, I should capitulate and actually throw all my dreams of self-determination into the Mediterranean Sea. So that's a really important point. Like I said, if you can go there, it is tremendously how gratitude people are. Like I said, I think that's completely misplaced. I'm going to quickly go through some of the subjective feelings and impressions I've got. I'm not claiming that these are objective. I'm not going to give you facts and figures. I'm only going to say the things I saw, but hopefully it gets, if like a pen picture for you to imagine as well. When you came to Kyiv at the moment, and Chris mentioned it, Kyiv, and people in Kyiv describe it as living in a bubble. So when you get to Kyiv, there's no armed police, there's no checkpoints, there's no blackout. The streets are packed, incredibly packed, as we found to our cost when we were trying to get round the town. Shops are full. There doesn't seem to be, on the face of it, any apparent shortages. Now, this is in marked contrast to 6 months ago, and I was told by people There was a very strict early curfew. There were checkpoints across the town, and there were very strict restrictions on the movement of people. There were no cars. There were blackouts, etc. I think people we probably went to Kyiv at a particularly unique period because, as I said, over winter everybody's expecting the attacks are there. While we're there were 3 air alerts, and what is very, very strange is you've all heard the classical siren, and so when they start to blare, initially we didn't know what to do. I mean, obviously we took our cues from the Ukrainians, but in all 3 alerts, people did nothing. Partly because they become such connoisseurs of alert that they can distinguish, or they do distinguish between different alerts. So the first one, we were just told, don't worry, it's only a MiG. And by what they meant was that a MiG fighter had intervened into Ukrainian airspace. It was long enough in the airspace to be detected. That set the sirens off. Nobody knew whether the MiGs would fire a missile or not. But nevertheless, people were very blasé. People blasé about drone attacks. They're very confident in the air defense system of Kyiv. That when you hear the descriptions of people living in high-rise buildings, watching drones being blown out the sky or sometimes getting through, it really does bring to you actually the gravity of the situation. But the thing they most fear, and again, this is a surreal conversation, is ballistic missiles. So you have a matter-of-fact discussion with people who actually say, you know, ballistic missiles, they're the ones I worry about because the alarms usually don't sound. In other words, they hit before you actually know it, or they're intercepted before you know it. You can't duck, you can't go to shelters. They are the real dangerous weapons. And as I said, it is really strange conversations we have. Virtually everybody, in fact, everybody we talked to had, certainly in the last 12 months, had either lost a friend or multiple friends, or had lost relatives. And it's clear that the war toll in Ukraine is increasing. You talk to the union leaders and they talk about hundreds of members that have been killed, and thousands of members who've actually become soldiers and fighting in the front. They talk about the need for rehabilitation, both mental and physical, for returning soldiers, but also workers. So for instance, the power workers union, we're talking about the attacks on the power stations, about how that led to deaths, but also people injured. And there's a real need in that country for rehabilitation and basic medical supplies. We brought 3 heavy bags, and I can assure you they were heavy and a real pain to bring. But nevertheless, it is that sort of basic stuff, which is just tourniquets, bandages, syringes, was not only gratefully received, but is actually quite vital because that's what their health service is missing. As Bev and Chris have said, that we went to a hospital, a children's hospital, and you know, when people talk about Ukraine, one of the good things that I think you should mention it, and Chris has mentioned it and Bev has mentioned it, is that people are frightened to bring their children to hospital for overnight stay because of ballistic missile attacks. Now that you might say, well, that's misplaced, but that is how they fear. That is their subjective feelings about the health service. So they bring children in, and increasingly the doctors and nurses are going out into houses and actually treating people at home. But as Bev said, as you walk through the very bare hospital, where there are virtually no ties, and again, a practical thing that hopefully PCS can do is collect ties and send it to that hospital, but also to the villages that we've mentioned, is the resilience of the doctors and nurses. All of them have been threatened that they have to make a choice between a pay cut or staffing cuts. Now, they've actually picked pay cuts in order to retain staff. So you're in the middle of a war, and one of the government's main objectives is to cut the wages of medical staff. It's literally true that the government, in the middle of a war, wants to cut the capacity of the health service because it thinks there's too many beds and too many hospitals for the workload. And as Chris said, you know, this is neoliberalism gone mad. And there are very real moves afoot to actually go to a completely insurance-based system during a war. And if you can afford it, you'll get health service. And if you can't afford it, you won't during a war. So when people say the class war always happens in a war, this is a first-hand sort of like example of that case. Just want to quickly go through, again, subjective impressions. Bev and Chris have mentioned the village where they are literally building temporary housing. It's literally just a rectangle, a block made up of laminated wood, insulated. It's very, very bare indeed. But for people who have nothing, who are facing winter, it is actually lifesavers. This particular charity lives on donations, but they also get people who come from Sweden, and they particularly were enamored of a man who came from Scotland with his wife, who was a carpenter, and he stayed there several months, and he's going to come back next year. But GMB, Unite, construction unions, you know, we should talk to them to say whether or not we could get volunteers. They produce 9 units a month. They are literally in the middle of a forest, and they said that they can produce much more. The only limiting factor is skilled labor. There's only 5 of them who do it, and these people also have got other jobs, but you know, and they're also in some of the houses that they have been blown up. So we talked to a villager who hid in a cellar for 2 days with his daughter of 7 when his house was raked by small arm fire and finally was destroyed by a Russian rocket. He lives in one of these things, and he showed us, and it is the most basic accommodation that you can think of, but nevertheless, he was proud that he had built it, but also more importantly, he knew it would survive him through winter, so we can help. Chris mentioned and Bev mentioned this plastic village that we went to, which is a series of interconnected plastic blocks, which during winter, when you put the heating on, becomes sodden with condensation. With small children, it's a real problem. But again, they were incredibly grateful just to have that, because the alternative would be the blown out buildings that we saw all around them. And there was a surreal moment, again, impressionistic, where we saw this building that had half the side of it blown out. Banksy, for some reason, had gone to Ukraine and put up one of his murals in the middle of this building. So you're there, and there were a few people from Kyiv, I think it was, who had been sent by some cultural group to actually take the Banksy back to, I don't know, Kyiv, and put it into a museum or a gallery or whatever. And then this very weird sort of like, you know, discussion where Banksy's there in the middle of a blown out building, but also in that building that is semi-destroyed, people still live there, because the alternative is to live nowhere, in the open, in a tent. And we did actually see some people living in the crudest accommodation. And again, we can help. We can help with, as I said, ties, we can help with construction, etc. I'll start to come to an end now, because obviously I've gone on too much. The trade union movement, I do think, and I'm proud that PCS has taken this position, should be on the side of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians weren't attacked because they wanted to go into NATO. They were attacked for great power reasons for Russia. The president of Russia has made it absolutely clear, I mean, in contradictory statements, I admit, that simultaneously Ukraine is part of Russia, and therefore it should just be part of Russia, or it's an alien sort of nation that has to be destroyed. But he is not going to give up. There is no slackening that I can see in the Russian war effort. There is no slackening of the oligarchs somehow going to overthrow him. They're making money. Loads of people are making money. The attack usually against Ukrainians is, oh, but the American arms manufacturers are making money. Yes, they are, and British arms factors. But nevertheless, they have to be supported, because the alternative is, as we've seen in every place that the Russian state has occupied in Ukraine, is that free trade unionism disappears. The first thing they do, one of the first things they do is abolish the trade unions that exist and force everybody into a state trade union with no pretense of democracy. Now, the Ukrainian trade union movement culturally is very weird, at least for people from Britain, but it is free. There is debate in Ukraine. So, for instance, I asked about Russian-speaking discrimination, and we had a very lively discussion where people said it doesn't exist. And they weren't stooges. They were people who actually were acute observers of the situation. They talked about how they talk to their parents in Russian, because many older people speak Russian, that they hear Russian spoken on the streets of Kyiv and other places, and people are not tapped for that. And again, it's one of these sort of, like, I'll be blunt, left falsehoods about Ukraine, along with somehow that Ukraine is either some sort of puppet nation or this is a proxy war. It's not. I'll finish on the point that Bev made and Chris made about what is the attitude of people about continuing the war. I met nobody who was jingoistic. There might be, that sort of like ritualistic, tokenistic, victory to Ukraine. But I met nobody who said, I want to murder, kill Russians. I want to destroy Russians, etc. I want to destroy Russia. The basic premise, certainly I saw, the people I talked, is, it was said very well to me by a military medic. He said, what's the alternative? Because the alternative is surrender. The alternative is actually being put into a police state. The alternative is their freedoms abolished. Their alternative is actually Ukraine as a state, a democratic state, very flawed for all sorts of reasons, being destroyed. And I think, just as in Gaza, I think there's clear moral choices here. You're either on the side of Ukrainians or effectively you're on the side of the Russians. And unfortunately, that's a discussion we're going to have further in the British trade union movement, because I think effectively, for all sorts of reasons, some trade unionists have notions about Ukraine that are wrong, but effectively mean that they want Ukraine, or they have to reach their logical conclusion that Ukraine should lose in order that there be peace, or that, I don't know, Russia somehow, as a great power, is allowed to extend its borders to Poland in order to counter NATO. These are ridiculous fantasies, but just to reiterate, and the very last thing is, if you can go, go. As I said, it's arduous, it's not dangerous. You will be welcomed, and you'll see a resilient people firsthand, and a people, as I said, that should be helped, people that should be supported. And obviously the discussion today, and obviously the coming weeks, and certainly over the winter, has to be, what support can we give in the British trade union movement and the labour movement more generally.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all three of you for going to Ukraine and for sending them solidarity on behalf of British labour movement and also practical aid. I just want to reiterate John's point about self-determination being an inalienable right. We either stand against anti-imperialism, stand for anti-imperialism and against imperialism everywhere, or not at all. And that's why it's so important that the Ukrainian people decide the conditions for peace, because otherwise it's on Russia's terms, and I mean, no Ukraine. I'm going to take questions now from people on the panel. I've got 12 minutes till I have to go, so people could be brief-ish on this round of questions, and then I'll hand over to Chris. Please either post questions in the chat or 1 second, let me see. Anyone hands up? Can't see any hands. Fred.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all of you for having gone there and making the effort. I mean, it's very important that we continue spreading the message that, it's absolutely right for the Ukrainians to resist annexation and occupation, just like it is for the Palestinians. It's a crime, whether it's in Ukraine or in Palestine. So, we need to continue talking about that message, and that if your country is occupied, it'll be normal that you want to resist that. You don't have to be manipulated by NATO or Iran or whatever to want to do that. So and even if Ukraine is receiving arms from the West and from NATO countries, it doesn't make it, John is quite right, it doesn't make it a proxy war. But of course, NATO and Western imperialism will have an interest in the outcome of the war. And with a moment of perspicacity by Zelensky at the beginning of the war, he said that there are those in the West who don't mind a long war because it would mean exhausting Russia, even if this means the demise of Ukraine and comes at the cost of Ukrainian lives. This is definitely in the interest of some countries. But it's up to the Ukrainians to decide what outcome, what peace they can settle with, and as long as we can speculate about all sorts of things, but as long as they want to continue to fight, it's our job as internationalists and as socialists to support them. Just finally, one thing about reconstruction and neoliberalism. Yet again, I see it wasn't reported in the British press that I saw, but in the French press, there was a report of a reconstruction conference in Warsaw 2 weeks ago on the 14th and 15th of November. So, the capitalist vultures and neoliberal vultures are there, and still in the middle of the war, they want to, privatize, and as has been described. Just one question I have to Bev. In Britain during the two wars, World War I and World War II, women went into jobs while men we're fighting on the front. I know some women are fighting in Ukraine, but I'm just wondering whether there's been whether there's that phenomenon as well in Ukraine of women going into traditionally male jobs, and has there been a change in attitudes towards women in terms of the role, breaking down of the traditional roles they are expected to play, and finally, just one thing that we need to get our heads around. Obviously, a lot of people from Ukraine who have settled here, come here as refugees with children going into school, some of them having jobs. I'm just wondering how, and we haven't got the answer here, how it will be for them to break, a settlement, the settlement here, and go back to Ukraine. Finally, just one last thing. I think we need, as Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, to talk about, not tonight, but is to talk about the Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped by Russia and are being Russified. It's a crime against humanity, against children, which we need to sort of address. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Fred. I'm going to take the questions in a round of three. I'm just going to read out Sasha Ismail's question. Is there a plan from PCS to get you, members of the delegation, to speak to branches? Also wanted to add that Ukraine Solidarity Campaign is continuing to organise or support solidarity groups linked to us in a wide range of unions, with new ones starting all the time. For example, just helped to set up a solidarity group in Unison. That's great. And a plug to contact Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign if you want to link them up with your union. I'm going to take a question from Sue next, and then I'll come back in the next round of questions.
Yeah, I've got a couple there, and they're kind of linked to the fact that Russia in its present form is always going to be a threat, and it's not just a threat to Ukraine, it'll be a threat to Europe. We know Russia has been waging hybrid war in Western Europe as well, and in the States. How do we put pressure on the government to recognise Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, which it clearly is? It's implicated in Syria, in Grozny, in Chechnya, and in Palestine and Israel as well. And in many states in Africa. It's high time the UK came to a conclusion that Russia is a state sponsor of terror. Quite clearly it is, and that it is committing genocide. You know, and this is not the first instance. Nadia quite rightly pointed out that, you know, we can't tolerate imperialism and colonialism at all. And we need to be quite adamant in our opposition and condemnation of Russia in that context, and also recognise that Russia in itself is an artificial state that has been created by an authoritarian regime that goes back centuries. And, you know, historically, it should really just be called Muscovy, and its republics and peoples that are disproportionately sent to the front line to fight for Russia are basically colonized. So I think there's something that we should really be much more holistic and comprehensive and congruent about in that. You know, I think just focusing on Ukraine is important, but the larger picture is actually Russia and what it's doing worldwide. And I was also I would absolutely urge people to go out, because it's an amazing experience, really amazing experience, and the people are wonderful. And I literally ended up in tears one night. We were out having a meal with volunteers, and there was a table of young Ukrainians next door, and on the next table. And, you know, they had a friend who was fighting in Bakhmut at the time, and this was the height of the fighting at Bakhmut. And everybody ended up in tears. So yes, it can be very emotional, but it is an amazing experience. Lviv is absolutely beautiful. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to going out to Kyiv, hopefully early next year. So yeah, urge everybody to go out. It is brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to, before I come back to the speakers, because I have to leave in 4 minutes and I don't want to interrupt people's flow, I'll hand over to Chris now to continue the chairing of the meeting and also to answer some of those questions. A huge thank you for having me, and I'd really encourage everyone to follow the Ukraine Solidarity campaign. Make sure you come to future events and keep supporting their ongoing work, because solidarity with the Ukrainian people is as essential as ever. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nadia. We have Mike, who has his hand up. Mike Davies. You have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, done that. Yeah, thanks very much for the 3 speakers and for being on the delegation. Very informative, very inspiring, uplifting, and a reminder of how important it is, while the media is distracted in so many ways, the national media in many countries, with the war in Gaza, that the war in Ukraine is equally important and equally about self-determination, as John said. And it's irrelevant, you know, who backs the victims, who backs the oppressed in this case, whether it's various members of NATO or whether it's various unpalatable regimes in the Middle East. The important thing is that we're looking at a people here who are oppressed by an occupying, an imperial power in the case of Ukraine. I wanted to and also just make another comment. I happened to tune into Al Jazeera because I was getting a bit sick of the way the BBC are covering quite a lot of the conflict in both the Middle East and Ukraine. And there was a Russian representative wringing his hands about the deaths of children. And I had to switch off because I felt that came after a Channel 4 program about child abductions. And it comes just before tonight's program on BBC Panorama about thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children who've been forcibly abducted from their families and homes. So, you know, the hypocrisy is rank from the Russian authorities on this one. And I wondered if that came up as an issue with any a view on the delegation, the fact of child disappearance and abduction, and whether that was part of any exchanges. Another question really is about conscription. I also have read very recently, well, not necessarily conscription, but the willingness of people to serve, and whether there is an issue there that you picked up, and what the trade unions are saying about people actually going to the front line, workers, trade unionists who may be being encouraged or being I don't know what maybe you can clarify what the situation is in relation to volunteers stroke conscription, and finally whether comrades on the delegation are willing to speak more widely about their experiences to not just trade union but other political groups. I'm thinking in particular Labour Party meetings, and whether that could be a follow-up to roll out the findings of the delegation.
Thank you very much, Mike. Lee, and then I'll take some comments back. Lee Barham, thank you.
Thanks. I think it's probably a question for John, but I'm aware that PCS donated £10,000 to help the Ukrainian cause, and I wondered if John's got any sense of how that money helped, and whether a similar size donation could make a material difference from PCS.
Thank you, Lee. Okay. I'll ask the speakers to come back. I'll start with reverse order. John?
Just to answer Lee's question, we bought £10,000 worth of medical equipment, and once it's all been delivered, we'll report that back to branches actually of what has been delivered. It's incredibly expensive, even the most basic stuff, and it does actually show you to blunt that the health services are certainly across Europe are just being ripped off. But nevertheless, they're vital. So it's just to repeat, it's £10,000 worth of bandages, syringes, tourniquets, because blown up limbs and what have you, but also various types of dressings, which are incredibly short supply. But as I said, that's what the £10,000 has bought us, and we'll report that to branches. Very early in the conflict, we gave, or the war, sorry, more accurately, we gave £10,000 directly to our sister union in Ukraine, which is the State Employees Union, who we met. And in fact, I've got a plaque that I have to hand over to Mark Sawotka and Fran, which is gushing in its praise for the union. It's over gushing, and we don't deserve it. But again, it just emphasises that people are very gratified to see you, because you're a physical manifestation of solidarity, and also it's a feeling, and I think this is a very important feeling that a lot of people in Ukraine suffer from, is that the world is going to ignore them. Fully understand the focus on Gaza, fully understand that. I think they're worried that the horror in Gaza will take the gaze permanently away from Ukraine, and that's the period that they're most vulnerable. In terms of other points, hopefully I'll get them. Certainly, we're more than happy, I assume Bev is, and Chris, and certainly I am, is to speak to anybody about our trip, or as one person called it from the NEC, a jaunt. He is a bit of a political opponent of mine, but nevertheless, it is of our trip that we're more than willing to talk to CLPs, certainly other unions, and obviously one of the things we have to talk to internally in PCS is about how can we also talk to union branches in PCS about what happened. In terms of child abduction, I have to be honest, I didn't discuss that with anybody, but maybe Chris and Bev might want to say that. In terms of Sue's point about Russia being a state sponsor of terrorism, I think this current government knows it. but I think this current government has got all sorts of links, financial and otherwise, with the Russian state. Also, we mustn't forget the Russian state is, I wouldn't say a major player, but nevertheless is a player in the City of London. It washes all its dirty money through the City of London. And so I think this government makes all sorts of compromises its head. Whether Labour Party will be better, I don't know, because equally they make calculations about the City of London. I think hopefully in the Labour Party, which is more democratic, and I don't want to overemphasise the democracy in the Labour Party, I'm a member of the Labour Party, I do think they're more pressurable, or we can pressurise a Labour government in a way you can't. Certainly the Labour movement is around, if you like, labelling Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. I think I've hopefully answered all the questions, but I'm sure anything I haven't will be picked up by Chris and Bev.
Thank you very much, John. Bev, would you like to add anything to the question in response to the questions?
Cheers. Yeah, just I'll start off with so Fred's question around women workers. I mean, as far as I could tell, there is a lot more women in general doing what would be classed in Ukraine as men's jobs. Previously, though, we met people that were actually now part of the union setups as well, which was more so in the independent trade unions. I must admit, in the state trade unions and in the FBU, I found that quite daunting in that meeting where I was the only female in the room, and it was quite a daunting experience with that. But at the same time, what I can see and my gut feeling is from the responses we got around me asking around job roles for women returning to Ukraine at the moment, there didn't seem to be much movement on that one. And that's where I think trade unions within Ukraine and our trade union movement can try and influence or even have voices within. So, as you said, yes, in World War II and World War One in this country, yes, many women went and did what was classified as previously men's roles. I didn't see much change in that, apart from there was a lot more women now working down the mines and things like that, due to the fact that there were lack of men doing some of those roles. I think what's really important is I was reading an article just the other day after coming back around homelessness in the UK, and the majority of people that are forecasted to be made homeless in the next 6 months throughout women through winter is Ukrainians. Because of the our government policy around the sponsorships and around refugees being able to find work and the rent prices going up and not being able to find homes, is that there was a study stating that there would be a lot more homelessness in the next 6 months, and it would come from Ukrainian communities in this country. And I think that's appalling, isn't it? And I think actually part of the reconstruction and the rebuilding of Ukraine, once that war is over, that everyone is hoping for, is around the fact that many of the women, and you talked about children's in school, and the woman that I spoke to on the train, life she has built in Northern Ireland for reason. We need to make sure that our government doesn't try and settled in this country, have made lives in this country at the end of the war, whenever that may be. So I think that's something we should be doing within our own within the Labour Party, because we're not going to get anything out of the Tories, are we? But I think that is something that we will need discussion on, because even if the war isn't going to be over for a long time, or it is earlier than we would hope for, we need to have those conversations now about the future for Ukrainian workers and people returning to Ukraine, how they rebuild their lives. For me, just to quickly point from Mike, I didn't have any conversations with anyone around any disappearance of children. I'm not saying that doesn't go on, but the people we spoke to, that wasn't in any of the discussions that came up, actually. And the only last thing I was going to say, because Chris is quite easily able to pick up the other stuff, and that is just really around the people speaking to branches. Yes, I'm more than happy to come and speak to any PCS branch, any other union branch, any platform anybody wants me to come and speak on. I think it is, obviously, we've done a report back. John's done it as AGS already, and done a briefing for members within PCS. Normally, and what I was disappointed in my own union was the lack of social media reports we were posting, and Chris was posting quite daily our activities on our delegation, and that didn't seem to get the same coverage as other things going on in our union at the moment, to our ordinary members on Facebook or Twitter, and so that was quite disappointing. So I think what we can do, if there are people on here from PCS, if you think that your branch would want to hear from myself or John, please get in contact with us, or get in touch with PCS headquarters, or Fran as current president, because I think it is important that actually members of our union voted for us to support Ukraine and to send this delegation. It's only right that we report back to those members that voted and were in favour of that, so that we can show them actually what we did do and all of the information we did learn while we were there. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you very much, Beth. It's appreciated. I could just touch on a couple of points that there was a discussion, it was covered at the youth conference that I spoke at, the issue of the kidnapped children, which could be reckoned to be in the thousands upon thousands of young people. In the context of the issue of justice for war crimes, in that it's known that Putin's been indicted specifically in relation to the kidnapped children, but it's entirely insufficient, and recognised as entirely insufficient, and there is a feeling that not a lot is being pushed on it enough. Certainly, that was the impression I got there, but I didn't see much more beyond that coming up. I mean, it's not that it's not a big issue. It certainly gets a lot of media coverage, and there's been a lot. In fact, there's been a lot of media coverage today on this in relation to Ukraine, to do with they've identified a child has been identified as having been forcibly adopted by one of the leading members of Putin's entourage, who was kidnapped from Kherson. So this runs right to the very top, and it really is just obscene, inhumane treatment. In terms of conscription, there's no plan as yet set out for a widening of, or the word in Ukraine is mobilization, of mobilization at this point. I do know that some, I think it was the former Minister of Defence in the UK, has called for an increased mobilisation, particularly of young people. But there's nothing come forward yet in Ukraine on that. And the head of the Ukrainian army's paper on the fact that it's a war of position, they want to get a war manoeuvre. His case wasn't for increased troops, but increased quality of weapons in order to break Russian lines, etc. Aircraft, new technology, things like that. So that it doesn't seem to be on the agenda that there's a necessity. I mean, obviously there is casualties being taken, and but they had 16 new divisions formed for the counter-offensive. They've not all been deployed. And I would say with the casualties, I mean, we did hear some quite harrowing account. I mean, particularly of someone telling us how pulling up alongside a troop train that was just full of wounded, and it sounded quite, heartbreaking, to be honest, on that. On reconstruction, and that this was very, very, very much a theme with trade unions and the left in general, and particularly the context of the issue that Bev brought up. Was certainly at that youth conference. The theme of that conference was how to make Ukraine it possible for people to return and for young people to stay. And obviously the agenda was pretty much along the lines of we need decent jobs, decent wages, and decent houses before anyone's going to consider coming back. to the country, or indeed for young people to stay. And that was an issue the medical workers constantly highlighting, was that I mean, we were told that the children's hospital we were at, every single one of the supervisory management staff had a PhD, highly skilled workers. And of course, like here, people are leaving to get jobs in other countries on better pay, and are really worried about that. And so that issue of reconstruction is pretty much alive, I think, with the trade union movement. I would say that I would share with Bev that in some of the, perhaps some elements of the hierarchy, some of the older movements simply, I think, hadn't thought about the agenda of women workers, or the fact that the vast majority of refugees abroad are women, and how they're going to be reintegrated back into the workforce. Hopefully after Bev asks them the question, they may well start thinking about it. But on there, if there are any other questions, I have a Zoom user but unidentified, so I don't know who they are. But is there any other hands? Well, while you're thinking, we have got a couple of announcements that I wanted to make on it, and one is that we have a so we have an event at university, sponsored by the University Colleges Union, which has been held at London Goldsmiths University on Thursday, 30th of November, 6:30 p.m. and on Ukraine, and we'll post the details for the Eventbrite in the chat. We also have a new crowdfunding launched, which is to build on the 5,300 we raised for a hospital in the mining region. In addition, on the first Friday just after New Year, we will be holding a film event in Covent Garden, to be announced, which is to show the film 20 Days of Mariupol, about the siege of Mariupol and the mass murder there. And again, that is to raise money for the hospital in the mining region. Please do donate generously and come along and see the film, which is incredibly powerful regarding the war crimes of Russia during that siege. So any final points then, or if not, we can move forward. Okay. Then that would leave it then. I really will
Chris,
oh,
can I just ask one question? I put it in the
no, you
chat.
can't, Chris. No.
I'm the Zoom guy, sharing one machine with my partner. I took just a couple of issues. Excuse me. One is a comment, and the other is a question. The comment, first of all, is around the need to keep up within PCS. I'm not as sanguine, perhaps, as John Maloney about the attitude of the PCS leadership to solidarity with Ukrainian workers and trade unions and Ukrainian people. It is sadly the case that the vice president of the union, or one of the vice presidents of the union, went into publication to suggest that John was overly interested in the Ukraine compared to Palestine, as he put it, when ironically, the only person who expressed issued a call for a halt. At that point, it was a siege when election addresses were published. Israel hadn't commenced the invasion. The only person amongst all the candidates for Assistant General Secretary and General Secretary, the current elections in PCS, who called for a halt to the Israeli siege, a stop to collective punishment, condemnation of the set of attacks in the West Bank, condemnation actually of the Hamas attacks, and for two states, was John. And yet he was condemned for being overly concerned about Ukraine. And I think that says something about attitudes in the trade union movement on Ukraine, and sadly amongst some of the left MPs. I think Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, has been little short of disgrace with his lack of agency for the Ukrainian people. In that context, I do think that PCS members who are committed to the continuing support for the Ukrainian workers. Need to submit motions and the like to this year's common conference to keep that position clear. I think it would be very helpful if the London and South East region of PCS was able to organise a meeting of the region. So what tends to, the General Secretary tends to block the London region doing this, but it would be good if we could organise a cross-branch meeting, because branch representatives are very hard pressed. So I think if John and yourself and Bev could give a report to the London and South East region of the PCS, that would be great. And whatever branches can get a meeting organised would be great. I think it's important that members hear the value of the solidarity that's been offered. And I think it's important that we get that across the members to maintain the union's position, seemingly some people not so keen. My actual question, because I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you guys, is to what extent are the Ukrainian trade unions in this incredibly difficult situation actually able to play the role of trade unions in the workplace at the moment, defending their members against privatisation and pay cuts and the like? What is the practical ability of the unions to do that? And perhaps, if I may, one final aspect of that question. It's disheartened me, but I've occasionally seen suggestions that leaders of Ukrainian trade unions are in the pocket of, I don't know, the State Department in America and the like, and that somehow disqualifies Ukrainian trade unions from solidarity, from international solidarity. I'd be interested in your views on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for your intervention there. Much appreciated. John, would you like to respond to some of that? I can certainly assist, but I'll give you an opportunity.
Sure. I mean, just to reinforce, obviously, clearly, if London and South East region wanted to hold a meeting on this about our delegation experience, more than happy to attend. As I said, we're going to have to put our thinking caps on about how we can talk to as many people as possible about what the delegation did on their behalf, actioning the motion, but also obviously our experiences and further work. I mean, that's a simple thing of collecting children's toys. I don't think you can underestimate that, the sheer impact that would have in the hospital, but also in various villages that we went through. To think that somebody in Britain, which obviously they think quite rightly is far, far away, had gone to the trouble of boxing up loads of toys and sending it to them, is an important thing, I think. It's not the same as medical aid, etc., but nevertheless, I think psychologically it's very, very important. Again, this notion that the outside world cares. Clearly, I will remain, given that this, I'm with my official PCS hat on, I won't say anything about what people's various attitudes are to Ukraine. All I will say is that in the last two annual delegate conferences, we've passed 3 motions with overwhelming support, and I think at least one unanimously, reaffirming our position. So if people did want to change that position, I think they would find it formally, at least, incredibly difficult. I think obviously the real worry is again a point that the Ukrainians made about people losing focus, or if you like, concentrating, and quite rightly I understand, on the Gazan emergency and then forgetting about them. Certainly I reject any notion that we have to have a hierarchy where you can only concentrate on one thing at a time. I think PCS can actually do good things around Palestine, about what's happening to the Gazans, but also maintain our support for Ukrainian trade unions. Very quickly, in terms of the Ukrainian trade union movement, I mean, culturally, that they are utterly different from us. They have different roots. So the way that they function is not the way I think British trade unions would function. So, for instance, apart from the free trade unions, there is no tradition, certainly in the more traditional, if you like, Soviet era or Soviet legacy unions of industrial action, petitions, complaining. To be blunt, that there is just a real notion of sort of like almost like corporatism, in the sense of if you have a problem, you write, and there is a notion of social dialogue in the country, and clearly the leadership of many trade unions put great play in that. And they think it's a real advantage for unions. In other words, say, for instance, got an employment law, they will be consulted in a way that the TUC wouldn't be. As I said, I prefer, if you like, the UK style of trade unionism, much more percussive and combative. But nevertheless, is obviously I'm not in Ukraine, and therefore, culturally, I would find it difficult to understand, if you like, how their trade union movement works. Just very quickly, I don't think they're in the pockets of the Americans. Though, having said that, we went to the Congress of the KVPU, and there were speakers from AFL, CIO, the American Federation, and the American Federation person I talked to after. It makes no bones that they get State Department funding to work in Eastern Europe, but his argument was they take the money, but they don't believe they're beholding on the American state, and they're critical of the American state in Eastern Europe. They actually, point out all the great flaws in America. But so I don't know whether that reinforces people's belief that people are in the pockets of the Americans. But that the AFL-CIO is much more active in Eastern Europe than, say, the TUC would be. The TUC tends to actually internationally usually stay in Britain, and actually doesn't see its role to go to other countries and talk directly to them about trade unionism. But nevertheless, it is. I do think that the trade union movement, and I'll finish on this, is free in Ukraine. Got no impression of state incorporation. As I said, their culture is different, their legacy is different, but nevertheless is I think genuinely the people I talk to want better pay, better terms and conditions, all the bread and butter issues, as we would call it in UK. They want the same thing for their membership. How they go about it is culturally different, but they want the same things.
Thank you very much, John. Bev, would you like to add anything on those points raised?
Only very briefly, and again, it's touching on myself and John, obviously a part of that delegation from PCS. That's why we're here. And to say that there, it was a hard fight to get our delegation approved by our NEC. I am a member of the NEC, but it was approved because that's what our conference and our members and our reps voted for. And therefore, I believe in the democracy within our own union, which is the members spoken, and therefore we should enact on that conference policy, which is what we have done. I do think, just for those of you that aren't in PCS, when I've previously done things on behalf of PCS, I don't normally get invited to go and speak in other branches. Whether that's just because it's that they would rather I didn't, but that's why that invitation is out there to anybody in PCS that's on this, or any other union. If they want myself and John to speak at anything, then we would be willing to, and really look forward to sharing all of the insights we found there. And just to go on, I mean, I did find a big difference, Chris H, on when we met with the FPU unions, as in the ones that are more like state run, as far as I was concerned. As John said, their view was, if you want a pay rise for your members, you write a letter to the government, because that's who you're with. However, although I'm not saying it was much better, the free independent trade unions for me were wanting to work in a different way and reform workers' rights, but also trade union rights as well. And I think that's something we should continue, and the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign should continue working with those free independent trade unions on a way forward to hopefully reform the trade union movement how they wish to have a trade union movement, because it's not for us to dictate how their movement works and things like that. But I think it was moving in the right direction, but there was a clear difference, in my view, Chris, of the different types of unions and how they support their members. I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Thank you, Beth. That's appreciated. In terms of industrial action, Chris, since the war began, so there was emergency laws introduced, no different from Britain in World War II, where industrial action's illegal. Nevertheless, in the mining regions in particularly Czerwonograd, with the Independent Trade Union of Mine Workers, which is part of KVP, it's an area that myself and Sasha visited in July. Those miners have taken quite widespread industrial action against management corruption during the war. And when I say widespread, they took strike action, they blockaded roads, they were pretty militant guys in terms of their, and women in terms of their activities. There are women in the mines. The deputy leader of the miners' union is a woman, I'll emphasize, yeah. So that strike action is taking place. The Free Trade Union of Medical Workers has been waging campaigns, quite vociferous campaigns publicly against cuts, against hospital closures. The nurses movement, Be Like Nina, again, has been having quite big demonstrations around nurses' job, nurses' paying conditions. No one in the trade union movement has been arrested or imprisoned. There's been, contrary to what some people in this country might think, Ukraine is not a fascist state. There is not suppression of trade unions, nothing like that happening in that country. Everything's open, everything's published, there's open organizing taking place. Now, obviously, the war has put immense pressure on people, and a lot of the activity of the unions is around sustaining services. In the mines, they're keeping mines running under bombardment because they need coal to keep the plants running to provide the electricity, etc. And similar elsewhere. So there is some degree of self-discipline by workers in terms of action they're taking, but action has been taken, people are functioning, there's no evidence of suppression. And I would say one thing that maybe was slightly, I wouldn't say cringing, probably embarrassing that I found at times, is the unions there have huge illusions in British trade unions that we are quite fantastic, actually. And to a degree that I have to agree with John, obviously we are quite a parochial country, Britain, in terms of the TUC, and they do get a lot of engagement from the European TUC, from the German unions. There was a delegation of the CGT there, who I was surprised, but they were there, they're bringing aid regularly. A journalist from La Humanité was there, which had been a CP paper, and so they are getting a flow of delegations from unions on the continent, but not from Britain in the same way at all. And certainly the aid work isn't flowing in that way from the unions, other than the work that we've been engaged in, I think. So it is a different than that, yeah. But I hope that answers your question, Chris. Sue has her hand up, and you're very welcome to come back in, Sue.
Yeah, I was just going to just going back to that point about the hierarchy between Gaza and Ukraine. I mean, the common denominator in both is Russia. And, Netanyahu has a very strong relationship with the Kremlin, and he chose to undermine the Palestinian Authority in favor of Hamas. So, he chose to make the situation more polarized. He chose to create the conflict, and he has this relationship with the Kremlin. And the Kremlin's strategy is to use polarization to destabilize and create conflicts. So there is a common denominator, and I think using that is a very strong argument for addressing both equally, that we must support Ukraine as much as possible in its opposition to Russian occupation, and indeed, in our way of supporting Palestinians, and you know, that they're very different conflicts, so different you can't compare them, but they do have this common denominator of Russia as an actor. And I was just going to also you know, really support Bev's statement about Ukraine's different culture of unionism. And you know, Ukraine is a very decentralized state, much different to the UK, which is terribly centralized. And you may argue me with that, but I mean, to me, decentralization actually makes you a more resilient democracy. And I think the way unions work there reflects that. And Ukrainian, they're essentially a very civilized society. So they don't like conflict unless they actually have to stand up and fight for their freedoms, as they are now. So, you know, that they're not fighting because they want to, they're fighting because they absolutely have to if they want to exist. It is that basic. And they don't see the use of force as something that they would use, or the you know, the adversarial politics that we see in the House of Commons and in UK politics, because it has been polarized. And yes, we have suffered from Russia's hybrid war, and you know, there is much to say about how Russia has influenced our politics as well. So I think respecting Ukraine's way of doing things is very important, and understanding that they have that difference. So yeah, those are just the 2 points I wanted to make.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I'm going to move to wrap up, and just one final point that I'll make before our last two speakers, just to any concluding points, was an important point that was that we did meet with or I think I did meet with the education union affiliated to the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine, who had this youth conference, and also they were organising higher education, and I hope that we can hold a future event with their sector organised in the universities and colleges, which might be of interest to our many UCU members and supporters in the campaign. So moving forward and concluding, I want to say thank you very much to everyone who's attended. It's been a really interesting discussion, and a huge thank you to the PCS Trade Union for agreeing to send a delegation, for allowing us to participate with them. We hope you go again. And I can see Chris Hickey's already his hand up to volunteer, so that's brilliant. And there he is. We're very grateful for your support and for your affiliation to the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. I do hope that you will continue to be affiliated and to support us in our efforts. So I'll just hand over to Bev and then to John. Okay, thank you.
Cheers, thanks, Chris, and yeah, any members on here of PCS, please, we'll have our conference again in May, but we'll be coming up to our AGM season in sort of like February, March time. So yeah, please make sure those motions to continue that support to Ukraine are put forward again to our conference in May. And my final one is just that plug again for increasing the aid to see whether we can do anything to help those children in any help whatsoever. So Chris has got a contact with an NGO for the villages we went to, and the people and the children living in those mobile units. They would be so grateful for any support we can give them. And just to reiterate, Chris said around just knowing that there is support from outside Ukraine is so important. And in that mobile unit, along the walls, the kids had put up pictures that children had coloured in and sent to them from other parts of the world, to know that they were being thought of. And they had stayed up in those mobile units because it meant so much to them that other people outside Ukraine were supporting them. So imagine what we could do if we could actually give them a little bit of joy while they're living in those conditions as well. So we've got the NGO contact through Chris, but also the contacts within and the hospital that we visited as well. So if we can do anything with that, I know I'll talk to Chris a bit more about how we can coordinate that and get that sorted for them. But if any of you guys out there can support with that, obviously get in touch with Chris as well, because that's my plug for the evening. And thank you ever so much for attending and listening to me rattle on. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Bev. It's so appreciated. John?
Thanks a lot, everybody. Yeah.
I just very quickly that I hope that PCS will send a delegation next year as well. I think it shouldn't just be an isolated incident, if you like, of PCS, that we just send one delegation. I hope that we'll follow up, because I think to maintain contact with the unions and various groupings that we've met, I think is vitally important. I also think it's important for the practical things that Bev said, like I said, which seem minor to us, but I can assure you, and this is one of the advantages of having been there, getting a box full of toys or even more jigsaws actually would be tremendously exciting for those children. Also, there's that particular group of people, the 5 carpenters who are building temporary accommodation, which is very rudimentary, but over the winter actually will save lives. And I think we should be working out how the trade union movement can help that. As I said, the biggest constraint is not wood or enthusiasm, is actually people. And in theory, the industrial unions could send a delegation over for a week, 2 weeks. 5 carpenters would probably double their production for the month. So there's that. But there's also other charities and organisations that we could be in contact with. But also what we hope to do is, and I'll finish on this, is certainly for PCS that we will keep up a dialogue with our sister union, which is as I mentioned before, the State Employees Union, that we contact them on a regular basis, that we have Zoom meetings with them. And obviously, I hope, as I said, and I'll finish on this, that we can have a physical follow-up delegation next year. I hope I'll be on it. And if Bev wants to be on it, that'd be fine if we're in position. At least now we know how to get to Ukraine. We know actually how to deal with the Ukrainian train system. And also, and I'll finish on this, definitely finish on this, it was a bit of a culture shock, certainly for somebody who's as reserved as me, that you go into a compartment of 4 sort of like bunk beds, if you like, and immediately the Ukrainians started introducing themselves. They have a much more communal based sort of culture, where certainly people like me are sort of like standoffish, etc. But even a curmudgeonly old man like me was won over by the sheer warmth of people on the train system, but also in Ukraine more generally.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Bevan. Thank you everyone for attending tonight. Solidarity to all of you. If we don't engage again, I want to wish you all a happy and peaceful new year, and please continue to support Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Martin.
Solidarity. Thanks. Bye.